Welcome to episode 5 from Mosaf's APIs over IPAs podcast network. I'm Derek Gilling, your host today and the CEO of Mosaf, the API observability platform. Joining me is Jessica Lamb, previously the chief architect and VP of engineering at LoungeBuddy. They got acquired by Amex, and she designed many of the APIs there, continuing to be used today. We'd love to hear a little bit more on how did you architect that and what were some of the design decisions that went into that planning?
Cool. Yeah, so the evolution of those APIs were sort of in my mind, like a natural progression of the company as well as the product. Initially, the product was just a mobile app, and then it has the app backing behind that, and there weren't any sort of API in addition to that. And after that, that mobile app took off. That was when I joined in pre-seed. And so as the first engineer high and also the chief architect, one of the first major projects that we were thinking of is how do you enable purchasing for lounges? And so some context on LoungeBuddy is that it's a lounge finder initially, and then later on it became sort of a lounge management platform. And so between the evolution of that is at the point where we decided to add purchasing, there was sort of the idea is that, well, purchasing lounges conceptually shouldn't be just restricted to the app. And so at that point, the insight was that this is sort of a concise unit of value that anyone can derive from. So in the future, if we're building a web app, or if we're building like a website or there are external partners, this concise unit of value can be kind of reused. And so going back to, my calculator programming days and offsetting repetitive tasks and really thinking about what is the thing that is repeatedly used that other people can derive value from. I think that's where the API ideas came from. It's like, well, let's not build it as part of the app backing. It would make sense that we start this API service. So thinking about what is the centralized way to manage all of those things. So the initial conception was that, so breaking it down, what are the essential steps for making a purchase. So first is availability, check to see if there's inventory for a particular lounge. And so just looking at that sentence, you realize that there are certain variables like which lounge. So that would be a parameter you pass in for the API. So kind of going through that is availability. And then so after you get availability, you take the thing that you're interested in, and then you ask, what is the pricing on it? And then after that, and then making the purchase. So initially thinking about conceptually what are the essential steps, and then just putting it out there and iterating on it. And so one of my core engineering philosophy is that it's actually better to try to make something easy to change than is to try to predict the future. So then that way, with our first, so after the purchasing API was constructed, we first start to test it using our mobile app. And so the mobile app start, using the purchasing flow, and then that help us work out the communication, as in whether or not the API makes sense and whether or not they're concise enough, or they're not, overly complex. After that has been worked out, then we started developing the website to use the same API, and then so on and so forth.
Really great to hear, especially thinking about concise units of value. Whenever you're looking at an API, understanding how do you provide more value to your customers, whether it's something that can be repeatable or used. How did you measure that though? Was there a way for you to understand, each value that each API is bringing to the business?
I think this is sort of, I would say that this is something that was lacking on the platform. And I really wish that you guys were around when we started this, many, many years ago, is that we didn't really have a way of measuring that. We were focused on air handling, making sure that it was robust and that people weren't experiencing errors. And we have some preliminary very surface level metrics around how often those APIs are called, but not necessarily anything more than that. And in terms of we obviously would know how many people make purchase through the APIs, but apart from those surface metrics, we didn't really have anything else beyond that.
I guess we should have started a few years earlier, right?
It's always the case, right?
Yeah. I'm speaking more towards your APIs. It sounds like, some of these were used by your mobile app, some were used by, your website. How did you actually organize internal APIs versus external facing ones? Were they the same? Were they different?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. My opinion or my principle on that is that just because you're internal doesn't mean that you get special treatment. I think one of the ways that was really helpful in using that principle for developing this API is that when we do open it up to external partners, like it just works. Because the way that we were managing authentication, we were actually us it, or the way that we were developing the API was that we're assuming every internal application that uses that API is actually an quote unquote external partner. And so we're not gonna like let the internal API have some special backend thing to like just optimize some small thing in order to do whatever they want. And that's, always a case of negotiation between, front end and app backing and API, because for anyone that has worked with different developers, people would always say that, oh, if the API just return all of this, it would be so much easier for the front end or something like that. And so resisting the urge to have those sort of workaround have make the API pretty clean, and also the separation of concerns and responsibility very clean across the system. So I think my recommendation for developing API internally is to treat every client as if it was an external client.
That's a really good point, especially when we go to larger companies where you do have so many different teams accessing that API. Each team is effectively a customer, right? And trying to ensure that API is really your contract and a way for you to iterate on something versus the shortcuts. Also helps for security, right? In terms of making sure the same security that you apply externally, you also apply to other teams, right? So you don't ever have a case where maybe a vulnerability in one area of your network. Speaking on these, APIs a little bit more, do you design the API up front, or was it more you start with the service and then organize it more around an API? How do you think about API first?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So I've actually done it two different ways. Excuse me. And so for the purchasing APIs, like it was very obvious from the onset that it was something that's going to be reused across the platform, across all of our different services and externally. But there were other things that kind of sort of like sneaked up on us. So for example, there was this one core utility on the application which is looking up lounges based on access rules and access items. So an example of an access item would be like your credit card. And then an access rule would be something like, if you have this credit card and you're inbound to a particular airport, then you have access to this particular lounge. Otherwise, if you're outbound, then you don't have access. So that was initially all inside the iOS app. And so what we realized later on when we did integration with American Express, for example, that there was a need to be able to access that similar functionality. And so at that point, figuring out how to effectively abstract that out is kind of an interesting process. So, there are people who would say that, okay, let's just stop everything, completely refactor that application, take out all of that service, put it in a different service. Like in my mind, that's actually a very high risk endeavor, and it doesn't give you necessarily as much benefits that you think it would. And so one of the way that typically I do this sort of migration or changing a paradigm within the system is to have sort of a, like not really an API gateway, but we have this service called like traffic control. And so essentially the expectation is that if you're accessing any APIs, you would use the traffic control service. And behind the traffic control service, sometimes the API is implemented in that service, but other times it's actually rerouting to the back end of another service that might have what you're looking for. And so then that actually facilitates migration in the future. Like as in, if you want to move the code from, an app backing into the actual service, you can optionally do that if there are benefits. But otherwise, you are setting the expectation that if you're accessing API, use traffic control, and you don't care about how traffic control get that information as long as that contract is with traffic control. So I think that also is a really good way to preserve velocity, because with startups, velocity is make or break. And so I feel like that way of operating was really helpful, to not have to predict the future. Like as we didn't know that we're going to be using this externally, but there's a way to do it in a very low risk way.
Well, that's a really good point, is the ability to iterate as quick as possible, especially for early stage startups. But you also brought up an interesting point also around migration, right? How did you actually have a process in place to make sure you didn't break your integration with the Amex or other customers? Or was there a process in place?
Uh, yeah, so startup and process, that's kind of an oxymoron. So there was a couple point of integration that we did with American Express. One is that their app uses our purchase API. And so right now, if you know log into American Express app and then go into like lounges, you can actually the QR code that's generated at the end of that is from the purchase flow. And then the other integration is actually when the iPad was introduced to the Amex lounges. There was the integration with behind the scene with the purchase flow, but also an integration with their external partner. And so the way that it works is that when someone swipes a card, that card number is actually sent to their service. So there wasn't risk, in terms of us getting certification and like all of those security stuff in place. And then after that, it would return an access item, and then we do something within our service to figure that out. We had a lot of error handling in place, like as in the initial integration with the third party actually had a lot of 500 errors. And the interesting thing is that they didn't have error handling, so they didn't actually know what errors were happening. But because we had error handling, we were like, we're getting 500 actually from you, and here are the error message or lack of error message that we're getting. And so for like the initial launch, I'm not sure I'm supposed to be talking about this, but it was sort of like, so on the front end on the app, they would see the 500 error, but because their service didn't have air handling, like it was up to us. Like there was a lot of back and forth from us and them. It's just like, okay, when this happened, we're getting an error from your service, even though the user is seeing error on our app. And so that's kind of the importance of error handling and very good error handling. Like anytime there is a potential for some sort of error, make sure to log it. Definitely.
Well, definitely having that, error handling and monitoring in place so you can ship with confidence, right? Without it, then you're almost flying blind. How did you actually set this up, and what were some of the challenges that you ran into?
Right. I wonder how much of that has changed, since I left about maybe a year or 2 years ago. But the way that we had it at that time, making sure to go air and and we were using Heroku
Hmm.
backend. And they had some tooling just right off the bat. Like if you had a over a certain percentage of air, then like you can set up an alert to track that. And so we have all of that in place in terms of having what was the other thing? The thing that calls you, PagerDuty. So we had the alerting on that setup with PagerDuty, so that over a certain percentage of error on different services, especially the core external facing services, like someone would get a call. And so the incentive on the team is that having all the error handling in place and then wanting to make sure you're not getting a call at 3 a.m. So
No, definitely. We see a lot of customers using PagerDuty, and so far the service is pretty good. Most of itself has an integration with PagerDuty too.
yeah, love it. Well, love hate relationship there.
Oh, definitely. When it comes to testing, did you have any best practices or process there? And what was that like? And some of the challenges were for testing your APIs?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. Um, when it comes to startup and optimizing, we try to go for the 80-20 rule. Like in terms like there, obviously theoretical best practices like, oh, we want 100% code coverage, or we want to make sure everything is tested. I feel like I'm a bit of a contrarian on that thought. My I guess my principle was that test the most important things, and then if there's additional bugs that over time has surfaced, then you add tests that way. And so doing the minimum essential thing and then looking at what kind of error you have, and then kind of build on top of that. So sort of the anti-fragile approach to development. um, so some of the thing that we did was obviously having really robust tests on the actual specific API calls themselves, like the get and post and all of that you are exposing externally, and then after those are completed, then sometimes depending on how often a particular service is called, we also do auxiliary, using auxiliary to do like a load testing just
Mhm.
before things get deployed, just to make sure, like just like a sanity test to make sure that things aren't like airing out randomly because high load and things like that. And so those tests are sort of phase in after initial launch. So it sort of goes back to what I was talking about before, getting something out there first and then seeing what kind of errors that you're getting back, and then making it more robust over time instead of trying to over engineer right off the bat. And so when we started to see like load issues, then we started to do the load testing, just to see if like here's like how many requests per second we're getting and things are airing out. Let's start doing load testing and for like 2x the amount, just to make sure that we have the padding there.
Well, definitely, and especially making sure you don't over-engineer is always important for startups. So engineering leadership, a lot of times you're balancing customer needs versus engineering needs, right? And you have technical debt that gets built up. What are some ways that you were able to iterate quickly and balance those customer needs without overburdening your engineering team?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and just from all the different startup that I advise or has worked on in the past, that's always the problem. Like as in, things are never moving fast enough, and there's always technical debt. So I think the way to kind of risk mitigate that sort of refactoring is to actually always leave the campsite cleaner than you found it. Like as in every new feature, so for example, instead of taking, a sprint or two out to refactor something because, it's starting to have technical debt, the ideal way to go about it is actually in the midst of fixing a bug or in the midst of creating a new feature, you're going to be touching existing code. And so when you touch it, if something is inefficient, like have the will to think through it, and realign the code base. Primary reason I think that technical debt is accumulated is that when you're developing the system for the first time, there are certain business assumptions around the relationship of models. And so over time, because of different features, and those relationships sort of changes. And so you notice that on a design level, you notice that on a feature level. And I think the missing part is that sometimes you don't do the work to change it on the code level to reflect that change. And so this kind of go back to the thinking about the system in a holistic way. It's not that you have design and then you have front end and then you have back end and you have system. It's actually all the same thing. Like as in there should be a consistent conceptual thread that runs through all of it. And design is just a visual representation of that relationship. And then so understanding that relationship deeply and making sure that that's reflected in code, in my opinion, is kind of the best way to minimize a code debt. Technical debt, and that's the way to make sure that you can move quickly. Because if those concepts is properly represented, to reuse them in the right way, it's super easy. And so there's this, ideal that when you're not even designing for a particular method to take on a particular way of being used, it should just work. It's kind of like a framework, and this is actually one of the reasons I really love Apple framework, is that things usually just works if you're using it the right way. And whereas a lot of time I think developers don't really think about the intention of the specific methods or APIs and just try to do it the way that they want to. And so I think this also, really taking the time to understand, and then refactor as you develop, as opposed to refactor, in a vacuum. Yeah.
Oh, really great insights, especially around technical debt and how to think about developing. Really great to have you here, Jessica, on our podcast, and hopefully we'll visit you in LA sometime soon.
Yeah, definitely.